everyone. Welcome to the 5 Beer Plan. I'm Brian, and this is the ongoing saga of an everyman's ale trail. In this episode, I explore the dark side of beer with a special guest, check on the fermentation in my homebrew project, walk along with Ron Extract from Garden Path Fermentation, and review a barrel-aged imperial stout from Juniper Brewing. But before we get this party started, here is this episode's burning question. What is your favorite imperial stout? My favorite is Interiority from Trapdoor Brewing in Washougal, Washington. This beer came from Tavour when I was able to use the service several years ago. This beer is a very dark pour. Barrel-aged, it also has a prominent whiskey aroma with a tinge of sweetness. Boozy, but as it warms, the whiskey mellows and notes of chocolate, vanilla, caramel, and so much more emerge. Rich and smooth. Well, welcome to another segment of Tasting Notes. Today I'm joined by one of my friends from the Untapped community, Mark from Castleton on the Hudson, New York. Mark, thanks for joining me on this segment of Tasting Notes.
I'm really excited. Great
Awesome.
to finally see you face to face.
Absolutely. So without giving out too much personal information, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do?
I'm a computer technician, so typical nerd. Been a self-proclaimed beer snob since May of 2013, chasing the ale trails like you, and a huge fan of black IPAs, so I was excited when you mentioned that's what we were going to talk about. And I got my buddy from the dark side behind me here.
I see that. Mr. Darth Vader himself. You're a fellow homebrewer as well. When did you start that?
Really early on, I got a regular homebrew kit as a celebration for a new job that I got. And over the years, I've upgraded. So I'm doing 5-gallon all-grain batches now. I only brew about once, maybe twice a year, though. I don't do it nearly as often as I would like. I think my liver thanks me for that.
Well, that's why they have things like Dry January and Sober Octobers and things like that. So, our beer journey together actually began in the fall of 2020 with some beer exchanges on Beer Advocate. I don't know if you remember that conversation or not, but at that time, that was like one of the most legit sites for beer trading because you got rated on the transactions and you were always really careful about, who you were trading with and whether it was legit and whatnot.
Yep.
I'm not sure exactly what prompted you to reach out. Maybe it was because I'd said that I was from the Midwest. You'd never really had any Midwest beers. But ultimately, after a couple of months of back and forth, I received my first Treehouse delivery from you. And you keep sending me Treehouse ever since, which is awesome. So I know you love black IPAs. Is Treehouse your favorite brewery then as well?
Yeah, Treehouse is top notch. Everything. I looked myself up on Untapped. I've sampled 294 unique Treehouse flavors over the years.
That's amazing, Mark.
Yeah, and up until just this month, it's been a 2-hour drive for me to get to Treehouse. It's not local for me. I don't even remember where or how I found out about them, but I started going there back in 2013, back when they had limits, so you can only buy like 8 cans at a time. I would drive 2 hours to buy 8 cans. There was once or twice where I had a different shirt in the car and a hat, and I got back in line again. I think I'm beyond the statute of limitations on that now.
You're safe.
Yeah. But they just this month opened up a new location here in Saratoga, New York. Unfortunately, that's more than a half-hour drive north, but it's certainly better than 2 hours.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're not crossing state lines and violating some sort of laws possibly that are antiquated.
Yeah, gotta love the alcohol laws.
Fortunately, We continue to trade today, which is pretty cool. And I happened to find, when I was in Wisconsin recently, Blacktop Cascadian Dark IPA from New Glarus Brewing in New Glarus, Wisconsin. As you know, or probably have learned, New Glarus isn't distributed anywhere outside the state of Wisconsin, which is pretty cool. I've had a number of their beers over the years. Spotted Cow is like their cream ale, which everybody loves. It's a great beer. But this one, as I read about it, it said that this beer took home the GABF's first ever black IPA gold, which is pretty amazing. And the brewery says this about the beer: expect it to pour a hop-forward jet black, glass brimming with aromatic bitterness. Master brewer Dan Carey skillfully weaves molasses and chocolate malt undertones with a soaring rush of clean citrus and pine hop notes to deliver a drinkable black IPA. Savor blacktop like Wisconsin's miles of licorice ribbons of ink that meander through armies of corn and bovine mowed fields. Enjoy the road less traveled, lean into it.
These brewers and marketers are poet laureates.
Absolutely. I love them. I love them. So, I've not had this beer before. I know you haven't either. So I'm really looking forward to enjoying it together. So are you ready to crack it open?
I am, and I've got a special glass for it. The first ever black IPA I drank was from a brewery called Roosterfish. Can you see that okay?
I can.
They're in the Finger Lakes, Western New York. They still exist as a restaurant and a barbecue joint. Unfortunately, they stopped brewing operations a couple of years ago. It was the first black IPA I had, and it blew my mind, and so I got to use this glass for this beer.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to use a glass from a place called Beard's Brewing. They're up in northern Michigan. My cousin had actually brought this back for me, but it has a beard on it. You can't go wrong with a glass with a beard on it. So let's go ahead and crack this beer open. Well, I'll tell you what, that pours a really nice amber color, doesn't it? Like ruby. I'm holding up to the light.
Yep. I was struggling with that here. A lot of glare coming in the windows with the new snow on the ground. Nice dark amber or almost mahogany.
Yeah, mahogany. That's a great description there. I love the head retention too. It's got a really nice, fine, a little bit dirty white colored head.
Yep. A little bit of citrus, pine.
Just a hint. I think this is very subtle. Well, I think it's time to try first taste
Cheers.
here. Cheers, my friend. It's just a nice piney bite to it, doesn't it?
It's got the bitter in the roof of my mouth.
Yeah.
It's got the caramel sweet initially, a little bit thin, but the caramel sweet up front, and then the bitter, especially on the roof of my mouth.
Yeah, that's a great observation there too. I don't remember what the ABV was on this.
6.9.
Okay, yeah. I think it's drinkable.
Right.
You're spot on there. It's definitely got that thin to maybe medium body mouthfeel, but it's definitely on the thinner side.
Yeah, I'm still picking up that caramel sweetness when it hits my mouth, and then transitions right into that hot bitterness.
And I love the way that like the Cascadian black IPAs just mess with your mind because you're like, oh, this is just going to be straight up coffee, and then you taste it, and you're like,
right,
it's citrus.
And look at how well it's holding that head. The lacing on the glass is amazing.
Yeah, for sure. Now, my head isn't holding quite as well because I've been drinking it. and frankly, you've got one of the Spiegel glasses, and that one's a little bit more tapered.
On a tall, thin glass like this, I love watching the lines of the lacing like growth rings on a tree.
And that's a sign, I think, of a beer that's put together really, really well also, because those are the things that you want to see with good quality beer.
It's been a couple of seconds since I've taken a sip, and the residual is a little bit of oil coating, like a citrus rind, the oil you get out of an orange peel. I'm getting a little bit of grassiness in that too, green grass.
And now that I've eliminated the head on mine as well, I'm getting a lot more of that citrus on the nose, whereas before it was very subtle. Now it's a little bit more present. And and even though it's got that bitterness here, it isn't overly. Again, it's very well balanced. I mean, I'm just really surprised at how balanced it is from the aroma to the flavor.
Because it has that multi caramel sweetness up front, the bitterness balances. It doesn't punch you in the face. It helps balance with that sweetness.
On the podcast, whenever I review a beer, I usually refer to however many there are out of 5 on the tasting board, and I do in half-order increments. So I'm curious, what would you think about this beer as far as your tasting goes?
It's a solid 4, probably 4 plus, maybe 4.25, 4.5.
And I would agree with you there. I when I was thinking through this, I think it's definitely a solid 4, leaning towards that 4.5, tastes out of 5 on the flight board. I think it's really well balanced. I can see why it won the very first gold at the GABF in the black IPA category, because it is really, really good. So I'd say, cheers. New Glarus knocked it out of the park on this one.
Yeah, cheers. I feel like I'm part of history here now, having tasted the first ever gold medal black IPA.
In this segment of Homebrew Hijinks, it's time to check the fermentation in the small-time chocolate porter. Within 24 hours, flocculation was evident as the yeast began actively working. It was like a slow boil in the fermenter as the CO2 bubbled up and was expelled by the yeast feast. At this point, the airlock was really pumping. I wrapped the fermenter in a towel to keep light from affecting it. I checked the activity periodically, and before I knew it, a thick, fluffy layer gathered on the surface of the wort. After about 4 days, the fermentation activity ground to a stop. The exhausted yeast dropped to the bottom of the fermenter, and the activity on the airlock stopped altogether. At this point, I put the fermenter in the basement to rest for a couple of days, just to make sure that fermentation was completely finished. Now I want to clarify one thing. All these brew sessions kind of run together. I misspoke in my previous episode. At this point in my homebrewing path, I did not yet have my wrapped pill. So I truly had to rely on visual evidence that fermentation had ceased through sedimentation and airlock activity. So thank you for your understanding. I waited for a total of 7 days from the time I kicked off the fermentation to make sure there was no activity. Next episode, it's time to bottle up the finished product. Now, it's time for Barstool Banter. This episode, I go back to the West Coast for a delightful conversation with Ron Extract, co-owner of Garden Path Fermentation in Burlington, Washington. I think you'll find it interesting to learn more about what makes this brewery unique. Welcome to Barstool Banter. I'm sitting down with Ron Extract from Garden Path Fermentation in Burlington, Washington. Ron, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me on the podcast.
Having me, I really appreciate it.
So can you please tell me, what is your role there at the brewery?
I am co-owner, along with my partner, Amber. We use the titles of co-creator, chief. We feel like it's less about ownership than ultimately kind of stewardship, that we're trying to bring something into the world that wouldn't have been here had we not done so, but also that is not just ours, but also belongs to our whole team, to everybody involved in the process.
Excellent. I think it's really necessary, especially in the craft industry, whether it be craft beer, craft cider, meadery, whatnot, that it's important to have a good team that work well together and help you reach the same goal. So that's awesome that you're giving acknowledgement to the entire team. I really like that.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
How long has Garden Path Fermentation been open?
So we opened in 2018 on April 13th, 2018, actually Friday the 13th. And it took a little time in planning. Amber and I moved here to Skagit Valley in 2016 to start this project, and it took us some time to find a location, especially because we were looking for something a little bit different from what we have here. We were originally searching for more of a farm location where we could grow some of our own ingredients and really offer a seed to glass experience. And that's still kind of our long-term vision. That's still something that we really want to achieve. And to that end, we turned down the location where we are when it was first offered to us because we thought it was a little bit too industrial. But then we ran into some obstacles in kind of finding our dream farm spot. So we decided to go ahead and get started here. And we've definitely come to love it and tried to make it into a destination of in its own right, but still hope that we can someday have that farm experience and offer that to our guests.
That sounds like would be a great destination to have. How did you come up with the name?
So Garden Path Fermentation, it's got a number of different references. We decided to call it Garden Path Fermentation rather than Garden Path Brewing because we are not limited to just making beer. We also make wine, we make cider, we've made mead in the past, and the focus for everything that we do is on the fermentation. It's on the transformation that happens through that process of fermentation. And we don't actually do a lot of wort production on site. When we were discussing it early on, we felt like there were people out there who might feel like, well, you're not really a brewery if you're not making wort. And I really didn't want to get into those debates. Neither of us did. So we felt like really focusing on the fermentation aspect of it better defined what we do. Of course, we do get people in here who stop in and try to buy kimchi or whatever. But nonetheless, it just seemed a little bit more all-encompassing. Now, as far as the Garden Path side goes, background on that is that Amber and I are both pretty hardcore geeks in a lot of ways. We come from academic backgrounds, and we both had a little bit of an obsession with what are called garden path sentences in linguistics, sentences that don't seem to make any sense because your brain just wants to read them the wrong way. And it seems like they're missing a word, or they have an extra word, or they just don't go in a direction that seems logical. And we felt that that was actually kind of an interesting metaphor for what we do, because garden path sentences, they ultimately do make sense. You just kind of have to take a step back and rethink the way the parts fit together, let go of some of your preconceptions. And we felt that really spoke to what we do. And then the idea of a garden path in general, it's a path that may not take you where you expected or thought you wanted to go, but that can be really beautiful and worth exploring. And it's usually used as a little bit of kind of a pejorative or in a negative way of being led down the garden path, being led astray, being taken someplace that you didn't want to go. But we wanted to kind of turn that itself on its head and use it in a way that focused on the journey and focused on maybe it wasn't where you expected to go or knew that you wanted to go, but that it can still be quite a beautiful destination nonetheless.
We could end the episode right there. That is a great description of, I think, what I imagined Garden Path to be when I met you first at the Winter Beer Fest. Because of the whole wild fermentation, because of the barrel aging, not a lot of people, maybe I should make that generalization. I think that there are not as many people in the craft beer loving scene that embrace wild fermented beers because they are funky, they are different, they're not normal. And I think that if you can go down that garden path, so to speak, and try a little something, you might be surprised at, as you said, where it's going to take you. I remember the first time I ever had a wild fermented ale, and I thought, wow, this is really bizarre. But the more and more that I've had them, I really enjoy that flavor profile, the sour, the funk. I'm actually just going to plug Little Fish Brewing. I'm drinking something that's a sour blonde ale that's aged in gin barrels with sumac. It's a wild fermented beer, and it's a fantastic beer. I love the gin profile, love the sort of the sumac botanical kind of vibe to it, but it's not something I would have drank 8-10 years ago because, it just is weird.
Yeah, I think for us, the Garden Path concept plays into what we do in a couple of ways. One is that our process sometimes leads us in directions that we may not have expected to go, but that can be beautiful and worth exploring. Yeah. But also that we hope to do that for our customers. And part of the way in which we do that is by actually not going in the extreme direction with what we do, not trying to make beers that are overtly sour or aggressively kind of funky or barnyardy, but to do what we do in more of a restrained way, to really try to embrace subtlety and nuance. And we certainly get people in here who expect us to be, I guess, kind of a typical Northwest brewery and walk up to the bar and immediately try to order an IPA. We also certainly get people in here who will walk up to the bar and say, hey, I hear you guys make some awesome sours. What's the sourest thing you've got? And we're going to take them in a direction that they didn't necessarily expect to go as well, but hopefully that they find beautiful and worth exploring. There are a lot of our beers. They're all mixed fermentation. They're all 100% native yeast, but they're not all, they're all acidic. All beer is acidic, but they're not all crossing the threshold of at least what I would describe as sour by any means. The majority of them really aren't. Our goal is to make beers that in some cases can almost present as though they were made with a clean lab culture, but then have that extra layer of nuance from the mixed native fermentation that we're doing.
So you mentioned the native yeast. Is that something you've cultured over time?
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing and it's ever evolving. So when we were first looking for a site before we got going here, we spent better part of a year just collecting samples of nature, of flowers, of leaves, of berries, of things that grow around us, and making small batches of wort, which we would divide up into a bunch of very small mason jars and just inoculating them with bits of nature, with these flowers and leaves and berries. Some of them didn't really do much. Some of them did things that we definitely would not want to consume. But some of them showed signs of what we recognized as healthy fermentation, and the ones that did, we would add to more wort and kind of build up and recombine. And eventually, once we had our site and we were ready to go, we started with a roughly 9-barrel batch that what we did first is we made a double batch of pilot wort. So we made about 10 gallons of wort that we pitched with the culture that we had built up. And then the following day, we brewed a 9-barrel batch of wort and pitched the active fermentation into those 9 barrels, and then brewed another 9 barrels and added it, and then collected the yeast from that fermentation and used it for the next one, and went batch to batch for a long time. We also did bank our culture at that point so that we could always hit reset button if we ever needed to. For the most part, we embraced the ongoing evolution and for a while just went straight batch to batch. But then once our cellar started to fill up and we slowed down our production a little bit, then we started with one yeast brink and then had several yeast brinks that we would use to collect different variations of the culture and then create new pitches. And then just early last year, we did end up bringing back our original banked culture to reincorporate into what we were doing to kind of try to bring back some of that original character. But we do embrace the evolution. We embrace the change. We're not trying to recreate the same thing over and over again. We're focused on making something that's always good, but not always the same. And to that end, on our bottled products in particular, you'll see addition numbers, which reference the fact that it's not a recreation of what came before, but it's an ongoing exploration, a new variation on a theme.
Okay. Yeah, I know when I was there at the Winter Beer Fest there in Seattle, I had a Saison, which was called the Garden Paths Led to the Flowered. And then I also had one of your special beers. It was the 5-year blend with Tayberries. It was a spontaneous ferment. That one was pretty amazing. So is that kind of what you're saying, is that you're blending the beer along the way? Is that what you're doing?
We do. We definitely blend, and the product always guides the process, not the other way around. So we're not starting with a predetermined path, so to speak. We're not starting out saying like, this is going to spend X amount of time in this vessel and then X amount of time in this vessel, and then we're going to package it and then we're going to release it. And here's the release date. We start out saying, all right, we ferment typically for products where we use our house culture. We ferment in an open top oak foeder, and it'll typically stay in there for roughly a week or so until the majority of the initial sugar from the wort is gone. And then from there, it can go into stainless, it can go into oak, it can go into be split up into multiple vessels and blended with older product from cellar, just really depending on what we feel it needs to be the best version of itself. And that's where it can sometimes take us in unexpected, but really beautiful and worthwhile directions. And sometimes not. I mean, part of the process in doing what we do is knowing that we're taking risks and knowing that there are going to be some of those risks that don't pay off, and there's going to be product that we have to dump. So I think that if you have a brewery that decides to delve into wild fermentation and they kind of do what we do in an overly regimented way, they may get lucky and it may turn out, but it's in a lot of ways riskier, because if you're committed to doing it in a very particular way and into a predetermined time frame, the chances of it coming out good are probably not going to be as high. You really need to be flexible in the approach and let the product guide you to allow it to become its best self. I did want to respond to something you brought up earlier about the beers that you tasted at the Winter Beer Fest and correct you slightly on one of them. The name is actually the Garden Paths Led to Flowered, which is an example of a Garden Path sentence. And all of our product names do kind of play on that concept a little bit. But it sounds like it should say the garden paths led to flowers, and people get confused because flowered doesn't seem to make sense as the end of that sentence, because your brain automatically kind of jumps to the assumption that you're talking about where the garden paths led, that it's telling you where the garden paths led. But there's another way to read that sentence, which is that it's about the garden that paths led to. And the garden that paths led to, the garden paths led to, flowered. It flowered. So when you kind of take a step back and read it in that way, it all fits together. And again, I think that's kind of a metaphor. And what's funny is that I think a beer like that, it's actually really, really approachable. But if you come into drinking it with preconceptions about what sort of style category it's supposed to fit into, or what the exact flavor profile or balance is supposed to be like, it may be really confusing. Whereas if you can come into it with an open mind, if you just walk in the door and you're looking for something that tastes good and that's enjoyable and don't have those preconceptions, it's actually a lot more approachable. So in some cases, I find that some of what we make, it's actually easier to find an audience among people who may not have as strong of a background in conventional brewing styles and in what we do, or conversely, people who have enough of a framework to really understand things that are well outside of those definitions as well.
I was going to ask you for an example of one of those sentences, and lo and behold, I proved the point.
One of the most classic examples of a garden path sentence is the old man, the boat, which sounds like it doesn't have a verb because it sounds like you have these two things, the old man, the boat, and there's no action. But the word man can serve as a verb, meaning to operate. And the old doesn't have to be an adjective. It can be a collective noun, meaning the elderly. So the elderly operate the boat. It's a great example. And we actually make a beer called the Old Man the Boat, which was in some ways the ultimate Garden Path beer, because it started out as another product that we make called the Wet Hop Chip. Another example of a Garden Path sentence, a beer that we make by using fresh hops in our cool ship. And I'll talk more about the cool ship in a moment. But we add fresh hops to the wort in cool ship, very unconventional way of making a fresh hop beer, but thing that we do here, and then add the wort from the cool ship into another portion of the batch that we start with our house culture. So the cool ship wort gets added after sitting on the hops overnight. It gets added to this active fermentation. So we're not really relying on capturing airborne yeast with the cool ship the way that we would if we were making spontaneous beer. We're going to get some of that capture, but the majority of the action is coming from our house culture, which is already going from the other portion of the wort. But when we went to make this beer in 2020, it's a beer that we typically make once a year, and it takes on average around a full year with some variation to produce the wet hop chip. But when we were planning on brewing in 2020, we had been on extended hiatus because of COVID, and our house culture was in pretty deep hibernation. So we tried to revive it to make this beer, and it was just not wanting to come out of hibernation. So we were a little bit really at a loss as to how we needed to proceed, because we were harvesting the hops. We had to make the beer. We'd ordered all the malt. We were ready to brew, but we didn't have yeast. So what we decided to do was to use yeast from the prior season's spontaneous fermentation, which was still going pretty actively. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about spontaneous fermentation in just a moment. But we took some of that yeast from the previous season's spontaneous fermentation and pitched that into half the wort while the other half sat on the hops. And it started fermenting. And then we added the wort from the cool ship that was on the hops to that active fermentation. And we gave it a little time, and it got really weird, and not necessarily in a good way. We tried a few different experiments to see if there was something that we could do to take it back in a direction that was more what we anticipated, but it just wasn't happening. And we came very, very close to dumping that batch on multiple occasions, but we decided to transfer it into oak and give it some time. Just sort of leave it alone for a while and see what happened. We still were not optimistic about it. We revisited it over the course of the next year or two, and still every time we tasted it, we're like, yeah, we are not going to be able to use this. But after about 2 years in oak, it really went through a transformation. It became something very different, and we thought very interesting in a good way, something that we really liked, that had a very distinctive character to it, and that we thought was worth putting out in the world with our name on it. But it was not the wet hop chip by any stretch of the imagination. So we had to really kind of rebrand that product. We keep kind of a running list of Garden Path sentences that might make for good beer names at one point. And high on that list was the Old Man the Boat. And we just had this realization that this is it. This is the Old Man the Boat. It's an aged version of the wet hop chip. There's that reference of the boat and the ship, and it all just kind of fit together. And we're like, okay, we have it. We have the Old Man the Boat.
I'd love to spend time with you and Amber. You just sound like so interesting, very interesting people. So that's pretty awesome.
Again, we're pretty hardcore geeks.
So tell me a little bit more. You were mentioning about your cool ship and the process there.
So not all of our products use our house culture. Our house culture, which is what we cultivated from the flowers, the leaves, and the berries during our first, prior to our first year of operation. That's what we use for our canned beers and for some of our bottled beers and barrel-aged beers. But we also make wine, which we ferment with the yeast that's present on the grapes themselves. And so it's a process of natural fermentation. We make cider using yeast from the apples, and we make spontaneously fermented beer, which draws very much on the lambic tradition from Belgium, where we capture yeast from the air by filling a broad, shallow stainless steel trough, basically called a cool ship, with hot wort that then cools down overnight, and as it cools, becomes literally a breeding ground for all sorts of airborne microorganisms that take residence in the wort, and then will slowly ferment it over the course of years. From the cool ship, it goes into a large oak tank, a closed tank, as opposed to the open one that we use for our other fermentation. It's a dedicated vessel that we just use for our spontaneous beer. And then it'll stay in that tank typically until we're ready to brew another batch. And then it'll go into larger format barrels or puncheons, typically 500 liters or 600 liters, which is roughly twice the size of a standard wine barrel. And it'll stay in there for at least a year most of the time, and sometimes upwards of 3 years. We actually have a 5-year blend from our first 5 seasons of spontaneous fermentation that we're getting ready to release, called our 5-year anniversary blend, even though we're now coming up on our 7th anniversary. Yeah, so we very much inspired by that lambic tradition, but given that we are not Belgian, we're not making lambic, we're not trying to replicate exactly what the Belgians do, but rather drawing inspiration from it to make something that's really truly speaks to the Skagit Valley. To that end, everything that we use, not only for our spontaneous beer, but for our wine, for our cider, for all of our beer, it's all locally sourced. Every ingredient that we use comes from within about 300 miles. The vast majority come from within about 20 miles. So it's really hyper local in that regard as well. And that just goes to wanting to make things that have a distinct sense of both place and time.
So I know the Pacific Northwest has a very unique terroir, and I suppose that's probably why you chose the Skagit Valley for your brewery, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the few places in the world where we could source the variety of ingredients that we can from within such a short distance. And that was a big part of what brought us here.
Yeah. So you mentioned your journey to Washington State. Where were you prior to that?
We lived in Austin, Texas. We both worked at Jester King Brewery. I was a partner there, managing partner. Amber worked in a variety of different roles, from helping with front of house operations to back office and events and all sorts of things. So we were there for quite some time, but eventually wanted to kind of do something that was ours, that we could do together, and wanted to be closer to our ingredients, really do something where we were surrounded by what was going into our products and where we could embrace nature in a little bit of a different way, using minimal temperature control, really embracing seasonality in that regard, which what Jester King does is super awesome, but you can't do ambient temperature fermentation in the summer in Texas unless you're trying to make vinegar.
So how long of a process was it by the time you said, gosh, I think we really need to go and make our own path? How long of a process was that to figure out exactly where you wanted to go? Or was it like you knew right away Pacific Northwest was where you wanted to head?
We gave it a lot of thought. It wasn't necessarily a long process in terms of time. Kind of once we made the decision, we had practical things to deal with, like our lease, the house that we were renting. We had a timetable where we had to move and decide where that was going to be. We considered all sorts of different destinations, including internationally, thought about where in the world we could do this. We decided, given our timetable, that staying in the US made the most sense at that point, because we already were allowed to work here and spoke the language and were familiar with the laws and all of that. And then within the US, thinking about where we could really embrace nature in this way, where we could source ingredients hyper locally, that drew us to the Northwest, and ended up choosing Washington because we felt that the laws here were a little bit more favorable to some of what we wanted to do, but ultimately came to Skagit Valley specifically because of Skagit Valley Malting, which sadly closed about a year and a half ago. But they were based here, and the founder of Skagit Valley Malting, really, he started the company to offer local farmers added value for some work that they were already doing, because there were a lot of farmers that were growing cool grains, heritage grains, that were different from what was being grown elsewhere, but they were growing them as cover crops or as feed, and not really getting a lot of added value out of that work. And the founders of Skagit Valley Malting felt that there was potential there to do some really cool things with it. It also ties in with the Bread Lab, which is located here. And some of your listeners may be familiar with Dr. Steve Jones, who uses some heritage grain to make what has been described as the world's best toast, in conjunction with various restaurants around the country and around the world. And Skagit Valley Malting kind of jumped on that same idea to make malted grain for breweries and for distilleries that didn't necessarily fit within the specs of what most of what was out there, and that wasn't as consistent necessarily as what the bigger maltsters could offer, but that was really unique. When Amber and I first met, Wayne Carpenter, the co-founder of Skagit Valley Malting, we really hit it off. And one of the things that Wayne had lamented was that it was difficult to work with a lot of breweries because they wanted this hyper consistency that they weren't able to offer. To which we responded, well, we don't want that. I don't care about consistency. I care about quality. You give me something that's awesome and that I'll never be able to get again. That makes it more attractive to me, not less. So that really made for a great partnership for a while. And they did ultimately shut down, which kind of forced us to cast a little bit of a wider net in terms of our malt sourcing. But that was a big part of what originally brought us here.
Last call.
It's nearly time to wrap things up, but first, one more for the road. This episode, I'm drinking barrel-aged Fade to Black from Juniper Brewing in Bowling Green, Ohio. From the brewer, aged for 18 months in a Buffalo Trace bourbon barrel, this version of Fade to Black has all the deep, dark depth and roastiness of the original, but with an added smoothness from the barrel. Enjoy now, or let it continue to age in the bottle. Without further delay, well, this is a 13% ABV barrel-aged imperial stout. I purchased this 22-ounce bomber directly from the brewery just about 1 year ago while having beer with my good friend Daryl. So I poured this beer out into a goblet just because I could. It is a jet black pour, deep and dark. So as soon as I popped the top on this one, the bourbon aroma just came rushing out. I really like the bottle art on this. Of course, the name comes from a Metallica song. The graphics for the name of the beer definitely lean into that. And there's just a huge guitar amp. Very simple, very effective, very cool. So, on the nose, clearly get that great bourbon barrel aroma. First sip impression, that's really nice. It has a nice roastiness to it. It is very boozy. This thing is burning all the way down. I'm getting notes of char, a little bit of maybe leather, maybe even just a hint of coconut, which is kind of interesting. It's very smooth. This has been refrigerated, so I would like to take some time and let this warm up just a little bit and see how the flavor profile changes. Okay, so I did let the beer sit for a little bit and warm up just a little bit. I would say that the beer has smoothened. That really strong bourbon flavor has mellowed. I'm getting a little bit more of maybe the roastiness, a little bit, like I said earlier, or that charred flavor, that leathery kind of deepness. Might be picking up just a little bit of maybe vanilla in there. But interestingly, one thing that seems to certainly have changed is that the finish went from being a boozy burn to being like a spicy kick on the tail end. I can't really explain it. It's really interesting. But overall, this is a really nice bourbon barrel-aged beer. I give this one 4.5 tasters out of 5 on the flight board. Cheers, Juniper Brewing. I am always looking for new craft beverages to review. So if you've got one from your favorite local craft brewery, meadery, or cidery you'd like me to drink and describe, reach out and let me know. That's all for this episode of the 5 Beer Plan. With so many podcasts out there, thanks for choosing to listen to mine. Join me next time for another special guest tasting. Reach the end of the road with Ron from Garden Path Fermentation. Continue with the homebrew project and review my latest homebrew. Remember to hit the subscribe button on your preferred podcast platform to be notified of new episodes. Follow me on Instagram as well, 5 Beer Plan 2022, to see what is happening on my personal ale trail. I'd love to hear from you, and there are several ways you may do so. Leave a comment for this episode on Spotify, direct message me on Instagram, or email me directly, 5beerplan@frontier.com. Be sure to support your local breweries, choose your beers wisely, and drink them responsibly. Until next time, keep walking your ale trail and stay thirsty, my friends.